In 1998, I got a new teaching job in a new town. To save money, I moved into a small house that was for rent. My roommate, Claire, was nice enough and the two of us got along easily. I moved in and found my room. While unpacking, I came across an old framed photograph. 3 men dressed as hospital orderlies were sitting together in the living room of the house. These 3 men had once lived in the house I was now renting with Claire. I didn't want to throw away the photograph, it didn't seem right. But I didn't want to keep it, either. I chose to hang the picture up in the living room as decoration and a reminder of the friendship that once bloomed in the house. On the first night, I was awakened by Claire stumbling around in the dark in my bedroom. Flipping on the lights, I saw Claire and realized that she was sleepwalking. I called her name and finally woke Claire up, and she, confused by what had happened, apologized and told me that she had never slept-walked before. Claire was shaking. She then went on to explain that she was having a vivid and bizarre dream. In her dream, she was in a hospital and a woman, a patient, was holding her hand and leading her down the hallway as if the woman wanted Claire to see something. The next morning, I went for a jog and spied an abandoned building a few blocks away from my house. The building was massive, the windows broken and the doors chained. There were no signs on the outside of the building, but by all outward appearances it looked like a hospital. I was staring at the building as if in a trance when I noticed that there was something, or someone looking back at me from the 5th floor window. As soon as I made eye contact, it disappeared. The whole area, the building and the quiet creeped me out. I ran for home. That night Claire and I sat down together to watch a movie, drink some wine and talk. When I brought up my crazy ex-boyfriend, Claire laughed a little. She remarked that my ex sounded like her during her wilder days. She went on to tell me that she had a mental breakdown a few years ago and that she was on medication, but she was better now and it was all behind her. Her story sent a chill up my spine. I barely knew her and I learn about this. Later when I went to bed, I heard a crash outside my window. I threw back the curtain and saw Claire walking off the porch, breaking a flower pot as she moved. I opened my window and yelled her name, but she didn't respond. Claire was walking down the street toward the abandoned hospital, sleepwalking, her hand outstretched as if she was being guided by some unseen force. I threw on some clothes and ran outside the house, still calling Claire's name. By the time I caught up to her, she was stepping inside the hospital doors. Someone had unchained the doors. I was too afraid to walk inside the hospital after her. I hesitated and I regret it to this day. When I finally worked up the nerve to walk inside, I was greeted by an elderly homeless woman. I asked her if she had seen anyone come into the hospital just now, and all she did was smile at me and turn away. I panicked and stepped back outside. The foreboding feeling was overwhelming. I looked up at the hospital and saw Claire hanging out a window on the 5th floor. I yelled her name, but I couldn't get her attention. I'll never forget the look on her face. Pure terror. Claire kept leaning out the window and looking back into the hospital as if she was afraid of someone or something. Sometimes she'd look down, seemingly straight at me, but she still never saw me. I called her name desperately as I watched her climb out through the window and jump. She died in front of me. The police arrived and I told them everything about Claire's sleepwalking. But when they learned about her history of mental illness, they quickly chalked it up to a suicide, and that was the end of her story. A week later, I read her obituary in the newspaper, and in the article they confirmed that the abandoned hospital was in fact a hospital. A mental hospital. I fell asleep that night. I had a very strange dream. I was walking down the hall of a hospital, a woman in a hospital gown holding my hand. She was guiding me somewhere, and she kept looking back to make sure I was still following. The snapping of fingers and a man's voice startled me awake. I had been dreaming. I had been sleepwalking. I had walked the 4 blocks from my house to the street of the abandoned hospital. A man had almost hit me with his car. If he hadn't have woken me up, I'm not sure what wouldn't happened. The idea of sleep was now terrifying. So much had happened in such little time. I tried to keep awake for as long as possible. But eventually, as it often does, sleep overtook me. The dream, the same dream about being in the hospital, repeated. This time when I woke up, however, I wasn't in my bed or standing in the street. I was laying the bed frame of an old cot inside the hospital. Scared, I walked through the halls trying to find the stairs and get out, but I found nothing. I heard muffled voices and screams coming from all the empty rooms that lined the halls. I rounded a corner and came face to face with three people all dressed as patients. One patient was the woman from my dream. I backed away and told myself they weren't real. If I ignored them, they'd go away. I kept searching for the exit and heard another screaming voice from behind a door. There was an orange glow creeping out from under the door and through the small window on the door. I peeked inside and a man's face peeked back. His face was burned. Horribly burned. He begged me to let him out, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the door. I turned and saw the same three patients as I had before. One by one, the three patients approached the window and jumped out. I looked out the window, but I didn't see them. I saw three orderlies running from the building in a panic. I yelled for them, but they didn't stop. That's when I smelled the smoke. I turned and saw the orange flames stretching out from under the door and smoke filling every hallway. I had no choice. I had to jump. I approached the window and prepared to leap out when I felt a hand on my arm. I looked over and saw the homeless woman pulling me away from the window. She led me out of the hospital and I ran for my life. The rest of the night I stayed awake and did some research on the hospital. It was abandoned 20 years ago after a fire ravaged the hospital. The orderlies all fled from the building and left their patients behind, to burn alive. I moved out of the house the next morning and back in with my parents. I haven't sleepwalked since. It was a dark and rainy day in February when I was hit by a small red pickup. February 15th. I was told I flew 15 feet before landing smack on my head. Apparently, the driver was drunk and didn't see me crossing. I don't remember that day at all. For weeks I slept, in a coma that many feared I would never come out of. I was placed in a ward of children and teens with major bodily harm or disease. My roommate was a boy named Mason. I never did find out his last name. For the time in which I slept, he found out bits and pieces of me from my various visitors. My favorite color, what music I liked, and other random things. The day I woke up, I was showered with love and attention from my family, and it took me almost an hour to realize the presence of the boy laying in the bed beside me. He flashed me a lopsided grin and quietly went back to the book he was reading. Eventually, I was left in peace, and after about 20 minutes of mental debate, I spoke up and asked him his name. His voice was smooth and low and never failed to make me shudder. We spent the rest of the evening playing 20 questions and becoming familiar with each other. Eventually, my doctor would break our quality time and give me the lowdown on my injuries and what the healing process would be like. He told me that when I was hit, not only did I give myself a nasty concussion, but my legs were also broken in my oh-so-gracefully landing. They said I had a 60% chance of ever walking again. We became close instantaneously. The nurses would laugh and say we already looked like an old married couple bundled up in bed watching whatever soap opera happened to be on television. Mason would just flash me his trademark grin while I blushed and buried my face in his chest. We both had our good days and bad ones, Mason and I. On a particularly tough day of treatment for him, we both lay together with him trembling in my arms. I'll never forget the feeling of his soft hiccups or the knot at the pit of my stomach. I finally got up my courage and asked him the million-dollar question. He had Hodgkin's disease. I don't think either of us slept that night. While my legs were transitioned from casts to braces, Mason's chemotherapy began. However, without fail, when I'd come back frustrated or in tears over a difficult session of therapy, he'd be there to comfort me with soothing words and reruns of I Love Lucy. Over the weeks, the chemo began to take its toll. His brown curls thinned to almost nothing, dark circles took permanent residence under his eyes, and his skin turned as pale as snow. As my legs grew stronger, the day I was released no longer seemed like something to look forward to. The day we decided to shave his hair was the day I broke down. I told him I would do anything. Give blood, bone marrow, anything to make him get better faster, but he just shot me his smile that instantly made me melt and wiped my tears away. 60%. Mason had a 60% chance of beating his demons. Same as me. On May 12th, I was officially released from room 104. I would walk with a limp most likely for the rest of my life. Every other day I would visit Mason. Each time I would leave we would take a picture together. Over the months I could compare our first picture and our most recent one and see how much he was deteriorating. It was heartbreaking. August 17th was the first time I lost him. Overnight a high fever had broken out and his heart stopped for 4.5 minutes. Those were the worst minutes of my life. I sat outside his room in an uncomfortable plastic chair watching the nurses I knew all too well scrambling back and forth attempting to save his fragile life. I didn't leave his side until he squeezed my hand, winked, and told me to go home and take a shower. After that, I vowed I would never let him leave me alone again. I guess the odds weren't in Mason's favor, for by the time Thanksgiving came around, he was almost a skeleton. But I didn't care. He confided in me that night, accepting the fact that his time was almost up and promising to wait for me on the other side. I begged him not to go, but he just lightly shook his head and rubbed soft circles into my back. He wasn't going to survive to see Christmas. That was 2 months ago. No longer being able to bear to see him hooked up to all sorts of machines, we decided to steal away in the night together. I bundled him up and we drove away in my mother's car until we arrived at an old cabin my family would stay in during the holidays. Mason and I couldn't be any happier. I don't care that I'm on the news every night, or that every cop in the county is looking for me. All I care about is being with Mason forever, even if his flesh is crawling with maggots and beginning to peel off his bones. Even if the smell off his rotting cadaver never fades from my skin. His lips are still warm at night, and he often whispers sweet secrets into my ear before we sleep. No one, not the police, doctors, or anyone else can ever separate us. I'm ready for them when they come. I made sure to bring the sharpest scalpel I could find when we left the hospital. But until then, I'll lay in Mason's arms, or at least what I think were once his strong appendages, and we'll talk all night until he takes me away. We'll be together forever. Appropriate. It says this in the rules, under the FAQ, word for word. Submissions are supposed to be creepy stories to spread around the internet for a bit of an adrenaline rush on those late nights alone. They're not real, they're not meant to be full of explicit gore or violence, they've always been simple stories. Sometimes overdone, sometimes with plenty of cliches or plot holes, but never truly chilling to the bone, not before that night. As most of you probably know, creepypasta.org receives plenty of submissions. I had started reading over submissions, deciding to help out after becoming a member. It was much harder than I had expected, to be honest. Most of the submissions I turned down didn't cross my mind even once after they had been rejected. Most violators followed a similar pattern. Blatant creepypastas, grammatical errors far too frequent to ignore, rewrites of previous pastas that had been done time and time again. Now, I'm quite the horror fanatic. I love movies, game, stories, anything with a macabre theme that would send chills down the spine. Unfortunately, being such a frequenter of these sites and sources resulted in a sort of immunity to the creepy. Reading through submissions never really made me glance over my shoulder or peer into dark crevices, not like it used to anyway. I got cocky, thought that nothing could scare me, that I was invincible to the supposed creep factor. I was stupid. It was late. My roommate was exhausted after studying for some class, so she had turned in for the night. My cat had been fed and was lounging in the other room, probably dozing off for the moment. Millie only ever got up to run around after I had gone to bed, finding that the most inconvenient time for me must have been the most fun for her. With no homework on my agenda and no work the next day, I tried to filter through as many of the submissions as I could, hoping for something new and exciting. Eventually, I got through rather quickly, rating each one and moving on. Shock Factor was next on my list, a submission from a user named Submission Filler. I wouldn't be contacting whoever this was. This seemed like a one-time thing. Regardless, I started reading through, almost bored at first as they seemed to go with the cliché setting of being alone on a dark, stormy night. Nothing stood out, at least not at first, but I kept reading. Maybe they'd surprise me, I thought. God, I wish they hadn't. As I kept reading, the story warped into some twisted torture flick. Apparently, the protagonist wasn't completely alone. He had someone tied down in the other room. The narration quickly slipped into a step-by-step account of a horrific dissection, without any anesthesia, on some complete stranger. The part that sent a shiver up my spine was the descriptiveness. It seemed so detailed, so involved. It was like nothing that I had ever read before, blunt and all too natural. I rejected it, of course. It violated the rules. The username looked fake. I simply discarded it with the others and moved on. It stuck, of course. It had disturbed me a great deal, but I brushed this off as just being a good narrative. If that submission had fallen within the rules, it might have made a good addition. A couple days went by, and at first I had forgotten all about Shock Factor. Eventually, I decided to look through submissions again. And again, I went through the stories and rejected whatever didn't follow the FAQ. Honestly, you'd think that some of these people hadn't even given the link a quick gloss over. And it showed up again. Shock Factor Part 2. Did this person honestly expect a Part 2 to be submitted when his first had been rejected? I felt kind of pissed off, thinking that this person had just resubmitted their works, and even a little bit nervous as I remembered just how graphic the last one had been. Regardless, I opened the submission and started to skim through. I was disgusted as I found that the narrator was up to his old tricks, this time with a younger victim, stated as being somewhere around 15 years old. I didn't bother reading through the whole thing as it somehow managed to disturb me more than the last one. Detailed accounts of torture and abuse far beyond what I ever wanted to read in my life. All the while, it had that extremely real feel to it, that tone that dragged me in and made me believe that this was some actual legitimate account for a brief moment rather than some sicko's idea of a joke. A joke, a sick joke to play on the staff for rejecting his first story, that's what this must have been. It was discarded, and I didn't volunteer to help anymore after that. For a short while I thought that it was over, and went back to my normal everyday life. Classes, work, boyfriend, classes, work, boyfriend, classes. I began to slip back into my schedule, though memories of the Shock Factor series kept bubbling up over the next week or so. I assured myself that it was over, until I received an email titled Shock Factor Part 3 to my personal address. It was impossible. There was no way that this guy could have gotten my personal email. I was unnerved, to say the least, by the fact that he found me. I tried to think of every possible logical explanation, even getting upset as I considered that my roommate had planned some elaborate prank to disprove my boasting over never being creeped out. After sending her an annoyed text, I received a new one, this time titled Shock Factor Part 3. You should read it this time. My blood ran cold. I looked at the description nervously, the glimpse of a message any Gmail user would be familiar with seeing, located next to the message title. This time there's a cat, and I know you love C. It read, trailing off. I exited the tab and closed my computer. On some sort of god-awful suspicion, I suddenly stood up and began searching the apartment for Millie. I called for her, looked under the furniture, I even asked my roommate about her, and for nowhere. I started to panic, convincing myself that whoever this anonymous sender was, they had somehow managed to get their hands on something close to me. My pet, out of my house, as the topic of one of his twisted stories. How else could he have known that I had a cat? How could he have known my email address? Who the hell was he? Months went by. I graduated, I moved on in life, I got a job. I never did find Millie after that, never did find out who was emailing me. My old roommate assures me that she knew nothing about it. Occasionally, I'll still get these strange emails, even after changing over to new addresses. New additions to the Shock Factor series, every time with a short description. The worst part is that, every time I receive a submission, it seems to happen just after I lose something. And whatever I lose ends up in the story. I'll misplace a sewing kit, and find Shock Factor Part 6, stitching, or I'll lose a pair of scissors and receive Shock Factor Part 9, cutting up. It scares me now. I dread checking my email, I'm paranoid, I never go out alone. It's putting a lot of strain on me, and on my boyfriend. I make him go everywhere with me except to work. The Shock Factor series has worked its way to Part 23 at this point. I don't know how much more of this I can take. If you ever see a submission from Submission Filler, an email titled Shock Factor, or from the address submission Space Filler, anything of the sort, please ignore it. For your own sake, ignore it. I don't know if that would even work. It's driving me crazy. I can't go anywhere alone. I feel like someone is following me, like this stranger knows everything that goes on in my life. I don't know how his stories got so realistic either, but I don't want to think about it. I just got a text the other day, too, one that has driven me to the point of seeking legal help. I'm going to the police now, he has my phone number, and he's not going to stay out of sight for forever. Part 30 will feature a guest star. I'm afraid that I'll have to move on to finding a new editor after she has her episode, though. How unfortunate. I knew her so well.